Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kurt Organista. I'm a professor of social work here on campus, and more importantly, a friend and colleaga of Victor Rios, who we're honored to have speaking with us today. You know, I could talk about publications and professional things like that, but I asked Vic, I said, what do you most want me to say? And he said, well, just give some impressions, some impressions that you have. So what I was thinking about is, just this week, we have a president who is condemning gang-affiliated youth, right, as part of the State of the Union, MS-13, And it's important when you hear the Attorney General and the President demonizing gang-affiliated youth and then conflating them with all immigrants, right? It's important that you have a scholar like Vic Rios who knows that experience both professionally and personally. He grew up in the flatlands of Oakland, the impoverished flatlands of Oakland. And when you read his work about how police treat and think about youth of color, particularly black and brown youth of color, you start to understand how the criminalization process works. You start to understand how children with developmental needs become affiliated with gangs to get those needs met. And that may not always have the best consequences, but if we're neglecting children like that, we're demonizing children like that, those scenarios count. So we're very, very lucky to have somebody with personal and professional insights with us. He did do his dissertation here in ethnic studies, and so it's welcome home, to Berkeley as well as to Oakland. He often says that he plays a sociologist on television, but he's really an ethnic studies scholar, and we're grateful for that, because that's the kind of study that lets so many communities of color see themselves and study themselves from a humanistic perspective. So,
thank you very much. Well, let me start there. I want to thank the Haas Institute for inviting me. I want to thank former mentors that some are in the room, actually, like Kurt. He showed me the first book proposal I've ever seen, so I didn't know what a book was, or the inside workings of a book and how to turn my work into a book. And I asked him I was very intimidated by him, because he was like the coolest professor on the Cal campus, and he would walk in with his sunglasses everywhere he went. And so I was like, man, should I ask this guy to show me his book proposal? And I took the risk, and I asked him, and he right away gave it to me. I copied it, and I got my first book contract. So there's other people like Victoria in here that were part of the department, and just around kind of supporting the students. And of course, the Department of Ethnic Studies was set up with a tradition of educating students on community-oriented research, on looking at the deep roots of colonialism, the deep roots of oppression, and then finding ways to make systematic change. But then I got here and I got a little turned off, because it was a little bit too theoretical for me. So then I went to hang out with sociologists. And then they irritated me, because they were kind of stuck in their own pretentious world. So I didn't really find a home, and I realized you never find a home. It's like all these multiple people, you got to just take the best of what they're providing and create something for yourself. So when I was here, I was very kind of disgruntled with Berkeley. And then I left here, and over the years I realized, oh, okay, this is what Berkeley did for me. And I just want to send a shout out to the Daily Californian, because today on the cover, I don't know if you've seen it, but they have a very kind of social justice, racial justice kind of commentary, and it might be just kind of talk, but at least it's there, and it's refreshing to see. And I just want to read a little bit of what it says. It says, there is an acceptable lack of representation for black writers in the journalism industry. It is not, however, merely a question of making space for black voices in journalism. It is a question of providing access to that space and of dismantling the barriers put in place to systematically suppress black perspectives. We are living in a time punctuated with racism, police brutality, and inequality. It is our responsibility, in light of these ways in which black people continue to be attacked and licensed, to listen, to learn, and to do better. And like I said, you know, it could just be commentary, but for the fact that it's in the front page and that people are talking about it in this way, it's refreshing. It actually made me to be proud to be a Cal alumni today. So thank you, Daily Californian, for doing that. Okay, so I'm here to talk about the miseducation and criminalization of black and Latino boys. I spent 18 years kind of on the streets, looking at the perspective of youth experiencing policing and punitive social control from kind of the street level perspective. I've been at different schools, different school sites, and then now what I want to present to you kind of 18 years later after the beginning of my research with young people is actually an in-depth school study. So I hung out in schools, I shadowed young people through their daily experience, whether it was in the community, whether it was at school, on the streets, at the park, in court. But this time around, in the last few years, I actually conducted a 2-year school ethnography. And the reason I went back to school is because I actually think school is the solution. If we restructure our education institutions, they can become powerful protective factors for young people. So that's kind of the conclusion of my talk today. So you can all leave now. So again, if we restructure our education institutions, they could be powerful protective factors for young people, because that's where a lot of young people spend their time when they're not kicked out of school. But when we restructure it, they won't be kicked out of school. So this is sort of starting a little bit with the work I've done, but then moving into the school research, just to give you kind of a new perspective of where my work has gone. Okay, so a little bit of my research agenda. I look at the role of social control in determining the well-being of young people living in urban marginality. I track the social consequences of the punitive state on school and policing experiences with young people. I examine young people's resilience and responses to inequality in criminal justice and education. You know, you got to study the whole. You got to study the entirety of the experience of the individual you're following. You can't just, like, at least in my perspective, follow people or watch people on a street corner or in one classroom. Right? You kind of have to go with them as much as possible to see the different perspectives. And one thing that brought to me was the ability to see the shape-shifting behaviors within a daily context of young people living in urban marginality. And that's going to be crucial because for a long time, social science has dichotomized marginalized young people. So either they're, for example, street or decent. That's one book, a famous book. And the more recent one is either they're clean or dirty, right? And so to dichotomize or typologize populations in just those kind of two categories really robs them of their experience and the totality of who they are as human beings. So this perspective tries to bring about sort of their full humanity, if you will. So my first book was based on the dissertation here, and it was a study of Oakland youth. Then this recent book, Human Targets, I'm going to talk about the theoretical perspective from that today. And then I've also done pretty much community-based work that doesn't necessarily start with research first, but actually starts with intervention first, and then kind of talking to practitioners about how we can make change. So sometimes I have to forget that I'm a researcher and just go in for the sake of going in and doing the work. So in Punished, you see the story of Tyrell, and you see the process that he goes through what some call the school to prison pipeline. So in 5th grade, he's harassed by police for being too tall. I asked him, what does that mean? He says, officer stopped me. He started pocket checking me. He said, officer, I'm only in 5th grade. Why are you doing this? He says, you're too tall to be in 5th grade. You look like a drug dealer. So the adultification of children of color, you can't just be a kid, right? You always have to be on your toes. You always have to be more responsible than everyone else because the scrutiny is on you to be so. So in 6th grade, his teacher's afraid of him, calls the police. Police comes to the classroom. In 8th grade, he decides to sell drugs. He says, if I'm going to be treated like a drug dealer, I might as well reap the benefits. His mother's evicted from public housing, becomes addicted to crack cocaine. So this is a story of the abandonment of the welfare state of the poor. And then I recorded 21 police stops in the 3 years I hung out with him, and I didn't hang out with him every day, once a week, every other week. And I asked him to record the police stops, and he said, are you going to pay me a full-time salary to do that? Because that's a full-time job. So I call this the youth control complex, a system of ubiquitous punitive social control. It's not just police, it's other institutions. It's a systematic stripping of dignity. And Jose describes it here. He says, man, it's like every day teachers got to sweat me, police got to pocket check me, mom's got to trip on me, and my PO's got to stress me. And so many of you might already know the story of the embedding of the punitive state with the welfare state. Or, in more practical terms, the way in which schools have begun to use or have continually used criminal justice discourses, practices, policies, and resources and embedded them in school practice. So for example, a very concrete example is zero tolerance. Did any of you in here go to high schools that had zero tolerance policies? Raise your hand. Yeah, okay. About a dozen of you. So zero tolerance was actually a criminal justice idea and practice first. Then schools were like, oh, we're going to borrow that. In the 1970s, 30% of high schools had a school resource officer in America. Today, over 75% of high schools have a school resource officer. So we really see the penetration of the punitive state into education institutions. And that's a story that's been told by a lot of people already. Here you see, actually, that's me in high school being dragged away by a police officer for being in a gang fight shortly after I'm kicked out of school. So this is where the interest comes from for me. So the expansion of criminal justice resources in schools, zero tolerance policies adopted from the criminal justice system, the school to prison pipeline, and then the culture of control. All are very prevalent here in the work I've done thus far. So in many ways, I started with schools, then I abandoned schools as a primary site of observation. And then in the last couple of years, I've said, you know what, let me go back to schools, because that's where I think the solution lies. So I did a 2-year ethnography at a high school. And I was really interested in classroom context, teacher support, and the role of race. And here's some of the kind of, just a piece of the evidence I collected while I was there. So one of the things I did is I actually observed AP and honors classes, which mostly white kids were enrolled in, and then what the school euphemistically called college prep classes. It's a euphemism because it ain't college prep, but that's where they're warehousing all the students who they can't engage in school. And and essentially just label it college prep. So you're going to see some images of college AP and honors courses, right? This is where the quote unquote smart students are. Oh, you see, it's a basic classroom. There's nothing there's nothing special about it. I mean, you have, you know, some DNA stuff there hanging. Okay, it's a basic classroom. All right, here's another classroom. All right, you have information. We were looking at informational support. I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of information there for students. And then look at this project. That's awesome. Look at this teacher's great. I mean, this classroom is like vibrating. It's like you want to be part. And I asked the teacher, this is an amazing classroom. What happened here? He's like, oh, you know, my students and I were just getting along, and I love art, and they wanted to do art. So we just got together on the weekend and just created this beautiful universe on the ceiling. Wow. So there's a lot of research in education that shows that when you produce these kinds of environment, you know, students feel an attachment to the teacher. In this case, they even got to hang out with the teacher on the weekend. These are the college prep courses. Same school. 100 classrooms. I took a picture of every classroom. These, of course, are representations of some of the extremes, but there's no kind of like middle ground. This is pretty much it, folks. 100 classrooms. I took a picture of every classroom. No information. At least there's some color there. Now, this is, talk about extremes. This is a teacher that had arguments with Latino students all the time about immigration. And one of the students was like, I feel horrific in this classroom because this guy has an image, right, of some zombie chasing a family, a migrant family. These are, for those of you that don't know, these are prominent along the U.S. border as real signs on the freeways, without the zombie, though. There's another teacher giving white kids. I found out about this through the white kids, by the way. Giving white kids extra credit for making CDs of what he called bug-a-thug music. And I said to the white students, what is that? Because the white student came to me, showed me the CD, and said, I just want you to know that he's giving us extra credit. So they felt guilty, even though they were making the CDs. I'm like, what is that? They're like, oh, bug-a-thug. It's like when the guys he doesn't like, the Latino thugs, are hanging out in passing hour in front of his class, he'll put a boombox and play this music to make them leave. I'm like, well, what kind of music is bug-a-thug? What would bug-a-thug? And they're like, you know, like horrible 1980s music, like one-hit wonder music, like she's a maniac, that kind of stuff. And it would it would make them leave, or at least that's what, so he was creating race within the classroom context and a racial order and pretty much providing whiteness a credit if they participated in rejecting brownness, right? And what was interesting here was that the white, again, so these are millennials, right? They're white students that are progressively minded, and they're feeling guilty about it. But listen, that's how whiteness operates. You know, I could feel guilty about it, but that don't mean I'm not going to get the extra credit. And it's like the Daily Californian, right? Like they're writing this radical piece on injustice for black journalists, but then you graduate college, and what happens? You live kind of a normal, quote unquote, middle class life. You go gentrify some neighborhood. You participate in the structural inequality. So we have to keep this energy persistent, not just talk about it, be about it. And even not, look at this Nazi right here, just flipping, you know, boom, right there. And the majority of the students are Latino in this classroom. But, you know, I asked the students, well, so what does that mean? What is the teacher trying to portray? And he's like, all he always says is about freedom of speech. Teaching us freedom of speech. Here's some quotes from the students. I walked into the classroom, and because of the Dickies I was wearing and the white shirt, the teacher picked me to sit with him. It wasn't fair. The teachers just know the white kids are the smartest, so they talk to them more. White kids talk with the teachers. They're more like friends, and they get away with more in class. So you're starting to see why I thought teacher support was an important kind of process to uncover. Because if I'm connecting with my teacher, maybe that becomes a protective factor for me. Maybe that teacher will help me out in the life struggle I have going on outside of the school and within the school, by the way, too. So these are the teachers, though. And by the way, I tried interviewing the teachers. They wouldn't talk to me. Most of them were white. They wouldn't talk to me. They would, but it was a very kind of like, and I was there 2 years. I was never able to gain many of their trust. So I ended up hiring a graduate student of mine who was white and who was a former teacher to go interview them. Totally different information. They invited her over for coffee to their house. They never invited me over. And this is what she got from them. Latino students don't really care about learning, and you can't force motivation. School is just not a priority in their home. Many Latino students relish the role of being academic dropouts. The only way I can control them is by texting the SRO. So there's this little phenomenon, right, that you can actually text the resource officer in some context. And they come to your classroom, pull the kid out. Some of you have seen the video that went viral of a young black girl being violently dragged out of a classroom by a police officer. Okay, so I'm excited with the theoretical part because the foundation of that theoretical piece, actually there's David Harding, who's in the room, was one of the people that, if you haven't read his book, you should read it. Because once I read that book, I was like, okay, we could build on this. This is an important framework. And so thanks for being here, David. And thanks for your influence. So I took that cultural framing perspective and cultural heterogeneity perspective developed in Harding's work, and I ended up sort of coming up with this idea of cultural misframing, right? So, and I'll break it down a little bit, but I won't go really in depth. 'Cause, then I'm going to sound like the people that irritated me when I first started grad school here. They were just talking theory. I don't want to do that. So teachers provide less emotional support to underrepresented minority students and to white students. Rocket science, no, we knew about it, but it's just empirical data to show it. And not just through what the teachers are saying and what the kids are saying, but through the spatial construction of the room in which they're interacting. Okay, so with cultural framing, think of individuals being informed in their day-to-day lives by these kind of resources of information that they could draw on when they're navigating the world. So I'll give you a very simplistic example. You have a kid in the inner city that wants to, aspires to make money one day. But at the same time, how that money is made is he's being fed two different instructions on how that money is made. One instruction, you might know, it's a cliche. It's like, oh, you sell drugs, you steal, you rob, you cheat. It's like the American dream. It's like, Wolf of Wall Street. So it's not just inner city people doing this. It's everyone in the culture robbing, stealing, cheating their way to success. And so that's one frame, right? That's like, this is how you do it. But then there's another frame that's kind of informing them on their decision-making process. And that frame could be, the way you do it is morally. The way you do it is through getting yourself an education and empowering your community. But maybe that frame is a little bit weak because there's not a lot of support an infrastructure for that frame. In other words, the government doesn't invest in programs that help young people become involved in their communities and learn how to become productive, engaged, organizing citizens of their community. So the media, the culture, the local context, peers are a big influence, might help to grow these frames that then inform these kids on how to decide where to move in the world. Okay, so the way I like to picture it is if you think of these clouds, right, of information surrounding them, some clouds are bigger, some clouds are smaller. For a lot of inner city kids, when institutions don't provide support and resources, those frames that inform them to be righteous, to be productive citizens, to organize in their community, to become self-empowered, to learn knowledge of self, kind of become weakened. And then, but they're still there. They're an asset. Those assets are always there with them. And the other frames that maybe inform them to make negative choices become powerful. So the takeaway from this is that institutions need to invest resources in growing those frames, right, that inform young people to do the right thing. It could look like mentoring programs. It could look like more nonprofit support, social workers, etc., summer programs, etc., job opportunities. So with cultural misframing now is this miscommunication that takes place between institutions and institutional actors and the young people that engage with these actors. So these institutions actually misread what a young person brings to the table, even if that's a positive frame. So the young person might be like, hey, teacher, I want to empower my community, and that might be read by the teacher as, oh, you're being too aggressive, right? It might be like, oh, hey, teacher, I want to go to college one day, but I don't like how you're teaching me. Oh, you're being defiant, right? So the misframing comes in the interaction. All right, so there's an interactional effect. So in other words, you can see it play out when teachers are talking to students and when police are talking to young people. You can see how there is a miscommunication, a misframing of the cultural perspectives that young people bring to the table. And then institutional power is important here. Like, we really have to pay attention to how institutions influence the different frames that young people bring to the table and that young people thrive with or survive with. And that's another important process to consider, that for some young people, a survival strategy, right, is to get by. But a thriving strategy is, again, to empower oneself, empower one's community, and that becomes one of the pivotal turning points for a lot of young people that have been left behind when they're able to not just empower themselves, but empower their community. All right, so the cultural sources of deviance have productive capacity, producing these critical frames, and I call it a paradoxical resistance, and that paradoxical resistance is when the punitive state cracks down on people so hard that it actually creates a productive resistance in some young people. Done with the theory, folks. All right, so anyone know what we're drinking here? Arizona iced tea. For local, huh? We got to work on you, man. You become institutionalized, bro. Messing with you. I know. I'm messing with you. There's 4 locals in the picture, but we're not drinking 4 Loco. But look, check this out. This gang task force officer shows up, pulls this young man from the line where we're hanging out right here, sits him on the ground, and there's Arizona, and I asked him, officer, what happened? Why are you stopping him? And he says, it looks like you're drinking alcohol, an alcoholic beverage. So pretext policing, we have a whole chapter in Human Targets about pretext policing, and we call it mano suave, mano dura. So in America, the way that policing takes place is that it's essentially a velvet glove that's disguising an iron fist. So it looks smooth on the surface, and police are talking about what? Legitimacy policing, trust building, community policing. But you uncover in the interactions, you uncover the iron fist still, right? And so we have to move beyond just building trust with community to actually building community. I'm gonna say it again, that's important. Not just build trust. Like, you can trust me, man. I'm a cop. You're on the street. You can trust me. And then 2 months later, I'm in court testifying everything you told me. Well, no. Let's build your community. That's what I mean. Trust building, community building, two different things. And if you look at Patrick Sharkey's work, he's talking about collective efficacy and how that's what reduces crime, not just trust building. Okay. So marginalized young people react to neglect, criminalization through rejection, truancy, and criminality. This has been the story in social science, right? Like, oh, okay, people, these young people, they're oppressed, so they reject their oppressor. Okay, that's an important insight, but we got to move beyond that, right? And the formal and informal cultural and political resistance is important to examine. And so here's some youth in Oakland. Now some might argue that's kind of an intense poster, but it's just like a seed, right? And if we work with them, right, those of us that are a little bit more on the like, oh, that's kind of intense, when you work with these young people over time, and we can argue whether they can keep that style or over time, right, create what some of us might consider more productive resistance. But the point is there's resistance there, and it's becoming formalized. So the punitive state activates political conscience in hyper-marginalized populations. Right, that's the paradox I was talking about. And right after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, I got together a research team and I said, we got to go see what these young people are doing. Because it was, for me at the moment, it felt like a new Selma. It felt like a moment that needed to be documented. So we interviewed about 140 young people that were out there protesting. And here's a clip of one of the interviews. How would you explain what's happening here in this community from the very beginning?
Well, I would start off by saying that it came like a thief in the night. It really did. Like, the knowing that a young man that was going to go to college and in less than 2 days and finna possibly be someone great, knowing that he finished school, he being a young black male in the poverty stricken community where the graduation rate is not that high. For him to make it that far, to pass that line, to be almost that close to the door, make it to us, basically, because I heard about shootings in Oakland, shootings in California from police brutality. And
has there been a change in your perception of yourself?
It really has.
What has it been?
It's the fact that I have a voice. Because to be honest, I got a brother, Jelon Green, that stays in Atlanta. He came down here and I was marching with me like, well, you out marching? I'm like, yeah, I'm out marching. We protest, because that's all I felt I was doing. Like, I'm marching, I'm just protesting, And he was like, man, you know what's going on? I'm like, what you mean? Like, do you know what's happening? I'm like, yeah, we protest. We standing against the police. He like, no, man, you this is a civil rights movement. I'm like, oh, like, like Dr. King, Malcolm X. I'm like, yeah. And I started crying, thinking about like, oh, for real? This is happening? I didn't really realize what was going on until he kind of really gave me the insight because he's much older. Like, this insight on what was going on. The next day I came out, it was a whole different ballgame. I mean, people know, man, this is a civil rights movement. We stand up for our laws. We stand up for our rights. We do what we need. We do what we need to do for us, for each other. We stand, just believe in what you believe in, and you believe in changing the system and changing the things that's not right in your community. You doing the right thing. This is a movement. And it was like, I was so excited. I'm talking about enlightened like crazy, like, because all I was thinking about was Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and all the great leaders that was out there doing what we doing now.
So you see kind of this young man going from being, and self-described kind of on the street. Some people might see him as aimless, without a purpose. He has tattoos on his face. He's not working. And all of a sudden, this happens down the street, and he's like there. And not realizing that he has actually started to lead a movement, right? And you see him, it dawns on him in that moment when he's marching. And that's what I mean by those frames of empowerment, those frames of transformation are there for everyone. They're just kind of not as strong as other frames because institutionally we haven't empowered those frames, because either the state has neglected purposefully to fund programs that would empower those frames, or the state is, in another perspective, is afraid, doesn't want people to become what? Radicalized, right? What the FBI call him? You remember the term? A+ for today. A black what? Black identity extremist. That's what the FBI is calling all the activists. Black identity extremist. A+. So here's the policy implication, folks. Dignity enhancement is crucial. We always, for those of you that are going to go out into the world and run programs and be policymakers and influence or push people to change the system, be in education, dignity enhancement is a key question. Every program, everything we do, we have to ask, are we enhancing folks' dignity more than we're stripping it away? Because we're always stripping away people's dignity. A bureaucracy by default strips people's dignity away. Racialization by default strips people's dignity away. Microaggressions are constant little baby strippings of dignity on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. Okay. So schools have to become sites of organizing and resisting, and honing in on the assets that young people already bring. We need to have social justice literacy, and I'm not talking about just for the kids. All these programs are like, oh, mindfulness for the kids, mindfulness. And I always tell teachers, what about mindfulness for you? I'm serious, like, oh, let's teach them to like relax and not be so aggressive. Are you sitting with them? Are you breathing and doing a little yoga exercise? Because all of us should be doing that. Oh, it's for the kids. Nah, it's for you too, especially you, because you're wrapped up in the bureaucracy, in the system. Ethnic studies, multicultural studies are crucial. Restorative justice programs. So like I told you, I don't just do the research. I'm also out there in the field just for the sake of being out there sometimes. In this case, at the school we were working at, we wanted to also do a survey. So my partner, Rebecca Morales Rios, and I trained a group of 100 undergrads from UCSB to go distribute a survey, all in one sweep in 1 hour, of 1,800 students. And we've been working with the school to reduce punitive interactions and bridge the opportunity gap. You notice the language, it's not achievement gap, it's opportunity gap. It's not at risk, it's at promise. Because what you label me determines how you'll treat me. You label me a risk, you're going to treat me as a risk. We got to tap into the promise. And then we also did a project in Watts in LA. Anyone in here from Watts? South LA? Berkeley, you got to recruit some South LA people. And this is a little short video clip of the work we did with the young people in Watts. You see, young people, sometimes your families struggle. And sometimes in that struggle, you find unhealthy ways to forget about that struggle. To deal with that struggle. Drugs, the streets, the hustle, abuse, self-abuse, self-hate, self-doubt, not believing in yourself, not signing up for this great program. You know what? School is not about just you. It's about your familia that has struggled. It's about your community and bringing your community up. And this is one of your opportunities to do it.
Staying out of gangs, that would be the most difficult because, I don't know, like, being out of there is not that easy, you know, because you may have stopped, but your enemies always remember you, always remember who you are, your face, or like, you can't change that. You may got enough of that lifestyle, but like, your enemies are still there, they're gonna forget about you. To me, I look at the street life as a sport. It was a sport because, I don't know, a lot of things you do, but at the same time you put your life in risk.
3, 2, 1, go!
Come on, try to put your feet over. Come on. Hey, don't grab this rope, William.
Hey man, I can't do this.
Yeah, you can do it. Hey, lift up your left leg. Yeah, grab on from it and lift up your left leg.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Let's go,
Let's go, William.
That's it, William. 3 feet, baby.
3 feet. Come on. Just take 3 steps. 3 steps, bro. Just 3 steps.
Espérate, güey. Baja esa madre. You got it.
There you go.
Hold the rope, baby. You got it.
Walk.
Got you.
Walk.
Got you. Hold the rope and just walk, baby.
2 more steps. 2 more steps.
Let's go.
Just keep walking. You got it.
Do it, baby.
Just focus on the rope.
There you go, William.
Walk, baby. You got it. Just
You
walk.
walk, babe. You got
Walk.
it.
I got this shit. I love it. Damn, bro. I love it.
Oh, hell no.
You got it. Nah, hell no.
Remember, I'm about to hop over that way 'cause my leg won't spit out that way.
I broke into an abandoned house with my friends.
Okay, so that, by the way, that film, The Pushouts, it's going to screen at American Sociological Association, American Society of Criminology, Society for the Study of Social Problems. If you know of any other associations you think it should screen at, just let me know. So, in conclusion, when marginalized Black and Latino boys encounter negative classroom context and negative quality of interactions at school, they end up pushed out on the street and caught up in the criminal justice system. Cultural misframing and the systematic stripping of dignity are prevalent mechanisms behind this process. And various forms of resistance are enacted by these young people. One way to support this oppositional consciousness and produce civically and educationally engaged students is by implementing a process of dignity enhancement as social program. Thank you very much for your time.
Some schools are starting to understand this cultural misframing and trying to come up with solutions from a very non-critical standpoint. And so some school districts I work with are really trying to replace cultural misframing with trauma-informed models. Like, kids aren't misbehaving because they're culturally fucked up. They're misbehaving because they're like mentally fucked up. And so these like other kinds of oppressive models are starting. So I feel like we're really, maybe not in all schools, but in enlightened schools, we're moving away from the school to prison pipeline and moving into this other disaster. I don't know if you have any ideas of like, how do we circumvent? Plus, like, I'm consulting with this project. Like, what can I do to try to circumvent this disaster?
That's a good question. Like trauma-informed approaches what do you think of right away? Deficit or asset? Deficit. But if you look into what they're doing, it's pretty dynamic, right? And the theory behind it, right? It's like you could have experienced, right, trauma, and then the kicker for me is always telling the system, and you're the most traumatizing of that experience, and you need to acknowledge that. It's like when you have people have racial breakdowns in college. It's like, I didn't know I had so much privilege, It's like that with like the education system. Like, we got to be reflexive, come to terms with the fact that we represent a system that's been oppressive and repressive and traumatizing to the children that have entered its doors. And then, right, okay, so we've traumatized children. Let's take responsibility. Yeah, maybe their parents did too. Okay, so you take accountability for your actions. We're in a culture of accountability anyway. So why aren't law enforcement and schools taking accountability for the trauma they cause on people? Oh, but the criminal needs to take accountability. And the little 10-year-old kid needs to take accountability. So we turn it around. We say, okay, you want to have a trauma-informed approach. That's fine. But let's look at where the source of the trauma, and let's transform that. And then let's not make it a deficit perspective. In other words, okay, maybe they have experienced trauma, but they're survivors and thrivers. And then how do you hone in to their own experience of finding solutions for adversities in their community, one of which might be trauma, right? So I think pushing those, like restorative justice. I met so many administrators taking credit. Oh, I do restorative justice in my schools. And you show up and it's just like a different version of the detention room. And so now it's a trend, restorative justice. So, but it's not just about restoring people. It's also about restoring institutions. So if you're helping with these projects, and the pendulum is swinging, right, a little bit. If you're helping with these projects or producing these or working for them, you just kind of have people turn them on their head and say, wait, we're the ones with the deficit as an institution. They're the ones with the asset that are going to teach us how to work this out. Yeah. Yes?
I really appreciate your work. I had a question about your field site and your knowledge in the field. So in your school site, you mentioned the juxtaposition of the good white student versus the bad Latino student. However, in places like South LA, Watts, Oakland, most Latino students don't go to school with any white students.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes the juxtaposition of the good Latino student versus the bad Latino student.
Yeah.
Did you see this in the field? And also in working with these targeted programs, how do you make sure that they advantage the most disadvantaged students rather than just getting the ones that were already maybe going to succeed?
Yeah, that's an important one. Two important questions. Okay, so really quick with the one question about the schools that have all Latino or all African American or a mix of both, which is the majority of inner city schools. I had already gone to all these school sites where it was all Black and Latino, and then I was like, I need a site, because I get critiqued a lot for two things. One is, how can you talk about race when you don't have a comparison of white students or white people, and so how do you know they're getting treated unequally? And so I was like, all right, I'll take this on. So this was like a 50-50 school, and but in the schools where it's Latino, yes, the Latino students that are high achieving, they have to give up a lot, right? They have to enter a system that trains you to be individualistic when, in fact, many of us come from a familial culture. I make it, you make it, we all make it. I eat, you eat, even if it's a crumb. In the individualistic culture, 100 years of education research said the number one indicator of success to make it in education is to develop an individual self. That don't work in our familial cultures, right? So a lot of these kids that are high achievers feel the burden of having to give up, right? Where they're coming from. We're writing a piece right now. We call it the Ganas mindset, not the growth mindset, the Ganas mindset. The growth mindset is like you're a little flower, and you flourish, and the rain comes and crushes you, and then you develop more little petals, and you grow. The Ghana's mindset, you're a redwood tree, and you're among other redwood trees, and redwood trees don't dig their roots deep because they don't need to, because they got each other, and they just entangle their roots, and that's how they grow so massively without falling down. So with the Ghana's mindset, it's culturally responsive, and that's how we come up as a community, whether it's with our culture, our home family, or our street family. That's how we come up. And so, for sure, high-achieving students have to give up a lot sometimes. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering what I have a two-part question. One is I understand Latino struggles with that. When you were in East Oakland, did you see the Southeast Asian struggling? Because we hear a lot of this dichotomy of like, we understand, we study this, we know the history of that, but there's other minority refugee camps that get swept under that rug too. But to keep it at a dichotomy, does it become inclusive again or exclusive again?
Yeah, you know what? That's a very important question. Southeast Asian population has higher incarceration rates than African Americans in Oakland. And so I have the focus for the Punish study was on Black and Latino youth, but one of the youth was actually Southeast Asian, and he's one of the ones that ended up with the worst effects. And I talk a little bit about Southeast Asian populations in the book, but not to do them justice. And you're right, we have to be more multicultural than we are about the conditions in which all these marginalized populations are going through. Yeah.
The second part of that, I mean, that sets up the trap. The way a lot of us are looking at it is like the way they're marginalizing Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian. You can see that like this drove from over here, and you can see like the trap that was set way before, and everybody gets stuck in. The second part is came from our neighborhoods and stuff. You're a professor. What do you think the role is? You as a professor, being that Santa Barbara does start to emerge formerly incarcerated populations, and your role to enable these students and somehow claw their way into UC system, kind of climbing this rank. Yeah. Do you take them under your wing? Do you put them on research? Do you give them paid positions? Anything for their CV to grow it? Do you think your role as someone who comes from our neighborhood, or even who studies this, should take that on as projects?
Yeah. Yeah, I currently have a grad student formerly incarcerated, and I've had undergrads also formerly incarcerated doing research. And, in terms of my work, whatever community I encounter, right, if I'm in Watts and there's a youngster on the street corner and he's like, hey, can you help me get a job? I'm there. I can't save everyone, I can't help everyone, and I shouldn't have a savior complex either. But I can't help everyone, but the people that I can help, for sure, that's my role. Like, I came into grad school saying I would be a community intellectual, and then the system tried to, tell me, hey, you be individualistic, and I fight that battle every day, though. It's not like I don't want to be seen. Like, there's a scene in this film when I'm in high school, and we're doing conflict resolution with this other gang that I was fighting. And I'm like, man, I just want to graduate. And then the teacher goes, oh, you should be proud of yourself. Like, you're making it. You're telling these guys that you're telling these guys that they should be like you, meaning you should be individualistic and go to college. And then I say, I also don't want to be painted as the good guy. And I'm a kid then, I'm a kid in that film. And now I still say the same thing because I don't want to be, like a hero. I just want to be someone that if someone needs a hand, I'm there, and then humbly doing it. I think that I've accepted my role as a community historian, telling the people's story. And my great mentor, Ronald Takaki, rest in peace, he taught me how to be a historian for the people. And he was a historian, he was my advisor. I happen to play a sociologist to collect a paycheck, but I do other stuff too, you know, and so that's important for me to keep my reflexivity going, for sure. Yes?
You spoke about some of the structures being the problem, right? The deficit in the structures. I've done a lot of work in East Oakland with a lot of youth. And one of the structures is crazy to me that exists. And I'm just wondering if you came across stuff like that in LA and what kind of work we could do against it. So busing existed because that was a desegregation tool once upon a time, supposedly, in a lot of places. But today, kids are bused across neighborhoods, which puts them in territories where they're not safe. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge part of the conflict. And a lot of youngsters are just like rocking colors just because now there's a little more safety with that, because I'm gonna have to be in the school, which is on the other side, and I'm by myself on the other side, or I'm with this on the other side. And so it just like it puts people in all kinds of so the Deep East goes all the way to the 90s, right? And you got Border Brothers, you got Latino, Sureños. There's 3 different colors, and the schools are dispersed throughout. Yeah. And you bust kids from this territory to this, and this to this.
I mean, safety is paramount. A lot of times with young men in particular, what we assume as a system is, oh, they're tough, and we never look at their vulnerability and their injury. So there's a great book on gangs in Chicago, and the whole book is just about guys that are injured and their vulnerability. Because we always talk about males of color, the assumption is they're tough, so we don't need to protect them, right? And the thing is that they need a lot of protection, right? Young people of color do when they're being bussed across different parts of the city to go to school. That's what I mean by intervening in terms of resources. We need to have people, the BTDTs, right? The been there, done that's that are out there, maybe like yourself, right? Conflict resolution, looking out for kids, facilitating safety, right? The community self-efficacy, investing in that is crucial. There was a question over there, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about the ethnographies that you were doing. Was that research that you did given back to the schools? Did they know, did they get to see the comparison of their classrooms?
Yeah, the schools got to see the data. And then so my partner Rebecca Mireles Rios, you should look her up. She's the real scholar in the household. She does. I'm joking, but she does all this great quantitative data analysis. And what she's found in her work with the survey data is that with the high achieving Latino kids and the high achieving white kids, teachers, when you control for everything, right? They all have the same grades, they're all high achieving. Teachers still encourage white kids more than Latino kids to enroll in honors and AP courses, to put them on the college prep track. So we showed all this data to the school district and to the principal. And they're trying, they definitely over the years have been trying to reform that, to change that. One of the things they did is they went from having honors as a very and AP, very exclusive club, 2 teachers have to nominate you, and then another teacher has to approve it, and then the principal has to put his stamp on it. Now it's you're any kid, and you want to take this AP class? Come on in and have a seat. No questions asked. Now that's a change, right? But then we also now have to what? Support that kid, because as one young lady told me, I'm just a brown dot in a sea of white. Yes?
I appreciate that you mentioned the role of teachers within the school inclusion pipeline, because I feel like that's not something that's explored when we look at research on the whole phenomenon. And so, I guess that's one instance where you mentioned specifically the role of teachers. So I'm wondering if you all have, or if you in general know programs or interventions or anything that specifically target teachers and their role in criminalizing their students, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, or it's this implicit bias that we know exists. And I guess I'm trying to collect data on this currently and look at research, and it's just so limited, the role of teachers specifically. And so I guess I'm interested in learning more about how teachers can be more of a protective factor.
Yeah, how teachers can be more of a protective factor, and it comes down to first of all, we got to recruit more teachers of color that come from these communities. But then second of all, the teachers that have good intention, most of them do, we have to consistently train them in implicit bias, in these kinds of topics, in social justice literacy, stuff that's considered radical in the system. We have to like have workshops, but we got to take care of the teachers. We can't just be like, oh, like I do a lot of professional development, and like for example, hopefully no one in Vegas sees this, but in Vegas, the school district makes the teacher show up at 7 p.m. to get a training on implicit bias, and the teachers are like falling asleep, you know, and they bring them like a little tiny granola bar, you know, like, and I'm like, you have to give them an extra period off, and in that period they go and develop themselves and learn, and like, look at what time of day it is. It's 1 o'clock. You're like the peak of the day. You got fed what you get fed, like chicken and good stuff, tofu, you know, skewers, right? Like, why aren't teachers being fed this stuff? Why aren't teachers at 1 o'clock getting to sit and intellectualize and learn about this stuff? You know, so yeah, we can't just blame them, because in many ways the school system is structured, right, to burn them out. It's high teacher burnout. So let's give them perks, right? Let's give them autonomy, an extra period, go learn this stuff, that's important. Partner up with an organization. You should look up, there's tons, but I'm thinking of one that's in Santa Barbara called Just Communities. And they have this cool curriculum for teachers, and in the summer, the teachers go to a retreat for 3 days, and they go through this comprehensive training. Just it changes their lives. They show up, they're like, whoa, I didn't know I was being racist. Like, whoa, incredible, I want to change it. But here's the other side of it. They show up and they're like, hey, colleagues, hey, 100 of you, listen, we're all racist. And the colleagues are like, get out of here. So we have to figure out a way to institutionalize it for everyone, right?
I have a friend who went to that, actually. I went to UCSD. And the thing about it was, I think she said it was voluntary. And so it was kind of like the teachers who already did.
Yes, preaching to the choir. Like you folks in here, right? It's voluntary to come. You're the choir, so yeah. Yes, in the very back, yeah.
So I have a question, more personal and for me also to learn is, you're from Oakland, right? You're from up north. So when you go down south, I know there's resistance, you know, I'm from San Jose. So how do you deal and overcome that, and how can we merge this gap between the northerners and southerners? I mean, I'm a Bison myself, so I could, you know, function between both. But the thing is that we never talk about this, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, even within like our program here, like Underground Scholars Initiative, is like there's northerners and southerners, and we all in the same space and nobody politicking. My thing is like, how could we do it, you know, more purposefully and actually engage with the community, that you could be in spaces together. I know it's hard when they, you know, they're active and it's like on-site kind of thing. How could we do it, you know what I'm saying, with more purpose and to, you know what I'm saying, stop this from happening, because at the end of the day, it's like, I can't just get like a northerner and a southerner in the same room, you know what I'm saying? So how do you deal with those interactions, and you just stay in one space and then go to the other?
Yeah, that's $1 million question right there. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the Underground Scholars Initiative. You've definitely made an impact, not just at Berkeley, but in the UC. I hear a lot about the initiative, so it's important work that you're doing. You never get away from the politics of politics. Like, there's certain things you just can't talk about, and that's the rules. It's unwritten, and I try to follow those rules. And when I got to Southern California and I tried, you know, I'm hanging out on the street and going to the local community center, they're like, oh yeah, we got these guys, and they're outside and they're on their, you know, beach cruisers, and then I show up and I'm like, oh hey, my name's Victor, I'm a professor, and they're like, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from Oakland, I'm from up north. Oh, you a northerner? That was my first interaction for this Human Targets book. Big mistake. I got lucky, you know, and over time. So the point is, I don't know. Because I tried, you know, like, studied them for 5 years. 70% of them never fully trusted me. Neither did I expect them to fully trust me. You know, like, for all kinds of reasons. But I went to the National Institute of Health and got a certificate of confidentiality. So the cops ever came to get the data, it's protected by the federal government. It didn't matter much to them in terms of trust, but for me, I felt a little bit better. But yeah, in terms of bridging those worlds, it's a tough. I've tried ever since high school to bridge those worlds, and it's tough. And I think it's the them. You know how I talked about frames? Them seeing like, oh, you guys are trying to help me strengthen this frame, like this part of myself, this part of my identity. I'm a shapeshifter, and over here I'm with my homies, but over here I'm trying to like bring food to the table for my family. That's the side you're trying to support. Okay, I'm gonna go with it. And so it's a creative process that I haven't mastered. I don't know how to bring people together. I've tried, and I think that's the best we can do is just keep trying. Yes?
Thank you, Victor, for your sharing. I really appreciate the ethnographic type of work that you do, bringing to life the lived experiences of people. One of the things that the Haas Institute represents is this idea of like, how do you get to structural inclusion? Like, we're looking at the systems and the structures that are behind the conditions that create these kind of lived experience, where dignity is stripped, as you named, and where individuals are not even able to really trust themselves. I'm really curious to hear you maybe share a little bit about how you think, since you see schools as a place, as a site of a solution, how are you thinking in your work about the systematic underpinnings of that? And also, just another thought that came to mind as you were speaking was Eduardo Vanilla Silva's work, you know, like where he really diagnoses this idea of institutionalized racism, where you have races, you know, racism without racist, right? Yeah. So we're really delving into these layers, and I'm just really interested in hearing how you're thinking about incorporating, you know, the analysis of the systems and structures and how it creates these conditions.
Yeah. Wow, this, I'm thinking about it, and like all I could say is my dream school is like, you know, you show up, and there's a handful of BTDTs, right? Been there, done that. That are working with the youth, therapists, all culturally responsive social workers, and they're there to greet you, right? And then the teachers have enough time to also be there to greet you. And it's a school where first they take care of your social emotional needs. Hey, how you know, the check-in, how you feeling? Let's check in. Anything you need from us, right? The feeling of warmth. And then you actually go do some of the academic stuff. You got some tutoring. And then a series of after-school programs. They're in the school, and it's open at night, so then parents show up. And then a kid gets in trouble, and the school rolls out the red carpet for the parent. Hey, how you doing? Come on in, welcome. Like, you want some coffee? Hey, listen, we're partners in this. You know, your son, daughter got in trouble. What do you think is the solution? Right, so like tweaking, right, what we're doing in education and kind of radically altering that academics is last, because when you teach to the heart, the mind will follow. And that's actually, now I'm talking in neurological terms, like you can't teach someone that has got a lot going on emotionally, because it's the same process of the brain that's operating. So like it's hard for them to learn. So I think that we make the schools into community serving centers that are open all day and all night. Yes.
Thank you for coming all the way. So yeah, like you've said, you see schools as basically that access point to be able to really intervene. And I'm just thinking about the youth that I've worked with, and a lot of them are so disillusioned right now, especially with the attacks on immigrant students, and as well as the lack of opportunities already that exist for students with felony convictions to access higher education. And so, and now you have this added element of racism that's just so out in the open. And so I was wondering, because a lot of them come to me and they ask me, like, what if higher education is just not an opportunity for me? What if it's not an option for me? And I know that a lot of the time that comes from that misframing that you're talking about, that people just told them that it's not an option for them. But I was just wondering if you have any ideas of alternatives to higher education that could maybe yield a different, like a productive, healthy possibility for our youth when it just seems like such a distant thing.
Yeah, I hear a lot of teachers say, "Oh, college isn't for everyone," and I always say, "Don't say that." I say, you prepare everyone you encounter for college, and then you also prepare them for a vocation, for other kind of experience and knowledge and work. But in the meantime, right, this is the goal, right? Why? Because statistically speaking, right, you are better off financially. When the crash hit, for example, 2008, the economic collapse, there was a high unemployment rate, but college-educated people had twice the chance of having a job than non-college educated people. So it's another protective factor, but doesn't mean that should be your entire world. And also, you should measure people based on where they started, right? We always are like, oh, college is the ultimate measure, but what about this young man William in the video? Like when we first got there, he was pretty much just on the street corner, and then when we left, he enrolled. This is the irony. He got expelled from the LA Unified School District. He enrolled in a program to get a guard card, security guard card, and then got employed by guess who? LA Unified School District. Now, there's a lot of a lot of us critical scholars will be like, well, he's working, for the system now, and then he's part of the security apparatus now. But for me, like the way I'm measuring where he was at and what he's doing and his influence on the youngsters, for me, that's success. I wished him to be in college and be a scholar, 100%. Did I try to prepare him from that and teach him that and demystify that? Totally. But was I happy when he got his guard card? Absolutely, and I'll take it. Yep. Yes?
I appreciate and agree with the idea that schools are the solution. But I wonder, I'm a teacher, you and I actually taught together, or worked at Willard Middle School together a long time ago. Wow. And in that time, Willard and Berkeley have changed dramatically. The population in Berkeley has changed, the demographics are different. If schools are to be the sites of, or the solution, but they're not stable, and in some way growth and progress means that the problem lies elsewhere. How do we mobilize? And schools are such local sites, and we're talking about a dispersed.
Okay, you know how I talk about, or not just me, but many other scholars, the spillover. So like we invested so much in the criminal justice system that it just spilled over into everywhere else, right? Its tentacles are everywhere. So what if we invest so much in the schools that their tentacles start to spread everywhere, right? So that there might be change in the community, but the school still has a productive capacity for the community to organize. Let's say the community is getting gentrified. The school itself becomes a site for the community to organize around how to solve the problem of gentrification. So that's my, of course it's utopian, but that's my vision, right? That yes, and a lot of teachers will tell me this too. They'll be like, how can I help this kid if like outside of school, their whole world is crumbling? And that's human spirit of grit, of resilience, of an ability to survive and thrive is there, and then we just have to push for resources to come about, and that's why I think, and what I've seen, in my field experience, I've seen some successful models of schools trying. Unfortunately, right now, what's going on with the whole charter school movement, right? It's some of a small number of those charter schools that are the example, but it's like this hybrid of privatized funds, and we have to actually have those spill over into public schools and have the public schools be the model, not the charter schools, because then that can spread to this public school system. We don't have to privatize anything. Yes?
My name is Leon. I would like to sort of echo the sentiments that Tia brought up about the institution, the structures behind it, and how we're going to make some movements. And I think that looking at the institutional actors first is important. So the teacher understanding what their role is in the classroom. Are they supposed to be a disciplinary figure? Because if they are, I mean, these particular students that I think we're talking about, right? Black and brown students coming from either poverty status, statuses and stuff like that, like we're bringing real trauma into the classroom with us. And if our parents don't fuck about us, then who's going to sit down for the parent-teacher conference? And if it's not the parent-teacher conference that's happening, but it's the teacher saying, oh, I'm going to call security and have security handle the student or whatever, they're being punished, one, for not being able to engage in the classroom, but then receiving other, punishments after that. It's like, who are we supposed to look to sort of be that disciplinary figure? Because a lot of students are coming in and having disruptive behavior, like we can't ignore that that's an actual reality in the classroom.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and comment. It's a two-tier strategy. On the one hand, you kind of dream up a utopia like this is what we need for our youth. If resources were no issue, this is what we would create. And we need to push politicians in the system to create that, right? And then the other one is on a pragmatic level, like day to day, how do we create change at a micro level as we wait for, right, the system to change at a macro level? Some might actually argue that micro change is systematic change because everything in this world, right, all the structures we create are just pretty much human interaction. But at a macro level, some might say, nah, like we got to just take down the system and create a new one. And I don't know that, I don't have an either or perspective. I have a both and. Like, yeah, let's create a new world, right? So at a systematic level, let's critique it and let's come up with new systems. Meanwhile, right, as folks are trying to do that, and I'm helping in that sense, I'm also trying to help a person at a time in this local context. I might just be here for a week, a day, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, but in my time here, I'm going to do my best to make that change in that microenvironment. And I think that two-tier strategy is important for us to consider.